gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Charles Perry. He was born in Los Angeles and is one of the world's foremost experts on medieval Arabic cuisine. Having majored in Middle Eastern Studies at Princeton University, and then University of California in Berkeley, and having spent a year studying Arabic in Shemlan, Lebanon in the early 60s, giving him the first real taste of the region and its food. He became a food writer for the Los Angeles Times, and in 2005, Perry translated from Arabic a Baghdad Cookery Book, also known as Al-Baghdadi's Kitab, al-Tabikh, the only medieval Arabic cookbook known to the English-speaking world. Welcome, Charlie. How are you?
I'm fine.
So before we jump into the medieval period, I want to ask you some questions about you. Can you tell us, I saw that you went to Lebanon for the very first time in 1962. What brought you to what made you interested in the region? What took you there? And what were your first impressions?
Well, what took me there, what interested me in the region, was basically the Arabic language. I read a description of it in an encyclopedia and I said, whoa, does anybody speak this? So I ordered a grammar of Arabic and it turned out they did. And pretty soon I was under the spell of the language. When I was studying Middle East studies, most of my fellow students had no practical purpose in mind for studying Arabic. They just, like me, they'd fallen under the spell of the language. And I got a scholarship to study in Lebanon for a year. And that's what got me interested in the food. I fell in love with Lebanese food and I still often cook it.
What was your first impression when you landed in Lebanon?
Well, that was the old Beirut airport. It was my first impression was unparalleled confusion. You had to have a guide to steer you through the airport. It was a much smaller airport than they have today, of course.
Yeah.
But my first impression of Lebanon was, well, frankly, my school was up in the hills. And my first impression was having the Mediterranean at my feet. And all that year, there was the Mediterranean as the background to everything we did.
Yeah. And you mentioned falling in love with the food, and a lot of the conversation that we're going to have today is about this idea of food, but also how it changes. Do you recall some of the dishes you had then? Well,
of course, hummus and falafel and tabbouleh. This was before they came to America and were ruined by health foodies. Health foodies just, health foodies think food should be bland and sludgy. Yeah. So they would always leave out the garlic and the lemon. Yeah, those were the first things that I really noticed, of course. Then there was, in the village, the Mukhtar had a little coffee shop where it often had lahm meshwi. And at the school, the cook was English. And so I got out of there as fast as I could and moved into a home in the village where Sit Wadia was a pretty good cook. And she cooked us a lot of yakhnis and kibbi and so forth.
And for those who don't know, yakhnis refers to the stews, lots of stews, which is perfect this time of year. And of course, at this point, you just arrived to Lebanon. Can you walk us through how that transformation was from contemporary Lebanese cuisine to what people were eating in the region hundreds of years ago during the medieval period?
It always seems to surprise people that people in the past ate differently. I think people sort of imagine the past as being kind of like the present, only a little bit different. The thing is that cookbooks do not record everything that people ate. There's no way to do that. The amount of different kinds of foods people eat is just infinite. So cookbooks, particularly in the days where they were copied by hand and cookbooks were relatively expensive, people did not care to waste time on a recipe for something that was an everyday dish that they probably already knew how to cook. They wanted special occasion dishes, party food. And the thing is that those were the fashionable dishes, and everything that's fashionable eventually becomes unfashionable.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing. And food is part of social life. And so most of the dishes in the medieval cookbooks have long gone extinct. There are still elements of them, features of them there that are part of dishes today. But whether there's a historical connection, it's impossible to tell.
Yeah, and I remember because you mentioned hummus just now, and if I recall my memory from reading Sense and Flavors, I saw that there are several recipes for a dish similar to hummus. And actually, I'm going to get to this topic later, the variety of dishes, you know, in several of the categories, they're like mlukhiyya, and there's like 4 versions, or certain dish, and there's several versions. Can you describe what hummus, or what this type of dish was like in the 13th century?
Well, it was the recipe that has come down to us is hummus kisa, and it's kind of a hodgepodge. It's a lot of different ingredients. It does not have the clear sensory or gastronomic impression that modern hummus does. Hummus today it's a sophisticated dish. You know, you got to have that special kind of dish to whirl it around and have just the right texture. The medieval dish, they were just playing around with the ingredients that they had, and they included chickpeas and tahini. So I don't know whether there's a historical connection.
And I remember it had like vinegar, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Herbs.
Well, that particular cookbook is from Syria, and it's from inland Syria. And so they often used other sour ingredients instead of lemons, because lemons had to be imported from the coast. Sometimes some recipes just specifically say lemons or oranges imported from the coast. But it's like present day Aleppo, they often use other sour ingredients other than lemon. They use pomegranate or tamarind.
And for the viewers who are part of this conversation who may not be familiar, who are these cookbooks written for? Like, who is making this food?
Well, the cookbooks, I think, were aimed at people who were the middle class and probably upwardly mobile, or hoped they were upwardly mobile, because they wanted to have special occasion dishes, the dishes that the rich people ate much more frequently. And so that there was clearly a household library where books were kept. And the cookbooks, in most cases, were just brought out and read aloud to the cook, whoever was doing the cooking. Of this 13th century book, Kitab al-Habib, only one of them shows signs of ever having been in a kitchen. And it really shows signs. It's a mess. Pages are all worn, there's stains and things like that. The other books are pretty much pristine, so they never saw the inside of a kitchen.
Oh, very interesting.
I mean, the cook might have been someone a member of the family, or it might have been, a household cook.
Yeah, and one thing that struck me from a lot of these recipes, aside from the variety, is that they're very short. They're very succinct. And I wanted to ask you, because we live in an era where we can jump on the internet and basically find any recipe in the world, how can we think about variety? Like, because I was struck, like, if I were to admit my lack of knowledge of the medieval period, I was assuming back then, before I knew all this, was that it's a very basic, very simple cuisine. And what struck me is the sheer variety of flavors, and a lot of the flavors that have disappeared from the contemporary Arab kitchen, or the regional, the kitchen of the region. A couple of things. How could we think about this variety in the context of globalization? And what has led several flavors or ingredients to completely disappear?
Well, I don't know much about globalization.
Okay.
But I will tell you that these cookbooks, in some cases, they do give very specific instructions, and the author expresses a decided opinion about what ingredient you should use and how you should use it. In other cases, I get the impressions that the recipes were kind of the basic skeleton or structure of the dish, and individual cooks would make their own variations, just as today in the Middle East, where and every mama's got a secret ingredient or two. She doesn't even tell her daughter-in-law. But if we can think of it that way, as I say, and no cookbook really records everything that's going on at a particular time. So we're just kind of guessing. We know that these dishes reflected the aspirations of people.
Yeah, and well, on the topic of national cuisines, which we see is very prevalent today, one thing that struck me as I was reading through these books is that there are references to identities, and having national identity being a relatively modern phenomena, how do you encourage us to think about when you reference things like Chinese cinnamon, or there's Egyptian canapé, al-Awsat al-Masriya, or Yemeni subiya? How can we properly contextualize these, what, for lack of a better term, are national identity markers?
Well, in the first place, some of these things just refer to the origin. Chinese cinnamon is a particular kind of cinnamon. And it was imported from China, or people thought it was. In other cases, well, in the Middle Ages, there weren't, the places were not organized by nationality. They were organized by whoever managed to be the ruler of the area. And so when I referred to Awsat Masriya, something like that, it just be people thought that this was a dish that was characteristic of Egypt.
And curious, since this book was written in Bilad al-Sham, Sense and Flavor, Kitab al-Habib, there are also, I noticed there are references to something like al-Tufah al-Shami, the Damascene apple, or the Palmyra olives. Usually when you give a name to a particular product, I'm assuming were these things exported? How is food traveling during this period?
Well, yes, the foods were traveling, and probably when an ingredient has a name on it, that was a premium in variety that you'd have to go to market for, and the market would have to have it. But that's what it's about. These are books for people who could afford, at least part of the time, to get the very best of things.
And can you, because this is a translation book, can you tell us some of some of the recipes that have stood out for you that you've referenced over the years?
Oh, well, I do. You see, you have something there about bezmawar. I'm very fond of that. It's sort of a gigantic canapé with meat and nuts, and in fact, just about anything you want to put in it. That's very good. Sikbaj, that's in one of the dishes that has also disappeared, but it survived in Europe. In my opinion, sikbaj was a Persian dish, obviously sikbag, which meant vinegar stew. And the first time I made it, I thought, boy, this is sour. It's an awful lot of vinegar in it. It's just about inedible. And when it got cold, I tried it again, and the vinegar was less noticeable. And in fact, it was an aspic. It was a jelly with a sour flavor. And an Italian scholar named Anna Martellotti has proposed that the word aspic actually comes from sikbaj. It would have been one of the dishes that were translated into Latin by the medical schools in Spain. And they often had a hard time rendering Arabic sounds in the Roman alphabet. And so she makes an interesting case that sikbaj is actually the origin of aspic, just as the origin of the Spanish dish escabeche.
Oh, wow. That is fascinating. That was another thing that struck me about this book, is the sheer number of fermented dishes. And I wanted to ask you how, some of them really jumped out at me as shocking. I think it was the Mosul capers that called for moldy bread. How could we put this into context for readers of, in the 21st century, making sense of these flavors?
Well, in that one, it's pretty easy. Moldy bread is how you make blue cheese.
Mm-hmm.
Moldy bread contains penicillium molds, and you mix it in with the milk, and microbes go to work. And so it's that particular dish is capers and blue cheese, essentially. It's sort of a semi-liquid blue cheese.
And do you feel like, on the subject of flavors, how can we, there's also, I'm guessing all these are approximations of what dishes would have tasted like. Can you give us an overall sense of what food was like in general, like percentage wise, or how would you characterize how many of these dishes had these strong flavors, or what we would consider strong flavors by today's standards?
Well, it seems that most of them were fairly strongly flavored. They used a lot more spices than is characteristic of Lebanon or Syria today. They had traditional spice mixtures, and really they have a whole gourmet thing about the use of particular spices comparable to, say, Indian cooking. Some of these spice mixtures are kind of like curry powders, only with different spices, of course. And so it was a lively flavored cuisine, because it was served with a lot of starches, with bread or with plain boiled rice, or thank you. So you wanted to have something that would stand out against that.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it's which we're going to get to about your favorite ingredient, but I'm curious about some of the other fermented. In another presentation, you talked about soy sauce, which we don't typically associate with the cuisine of the region. Can you explain how that was used in the medieval period, or a soy sauce like sauce?
We might as well call it soy sauce. The flavor of Chinese soy sauce does not come from soybeans. It's entirely created by microbial action. Any source of proteins and carbohydrates, if you let it be attacked first by molds, which will convert the proteins into amino acids and the starches into sugars, and then you add water so that yeasts and bacteria can start to work. And you add enough salt to keep out the bad guys that are going to make it taste bad or even be poisonous. Mm-hmm. You can make soy sauce out of barley, and that's what they did. It's interesting to me that it existed. It seems to have been invented entirely independently of the soy sauce of the Far East. You can tell that by the fact that the terminology is a mixture of Greek, Arabic, Aramaic, and Persian. So that tells you that there was a whole lot of ferment going on in the Fertile Crescent area that led to this ingredient. And it was used as an ingredient in dishes. And it seems clear to me that it was also, you could have it as a condiment on the table, just as you would also have a little plate of spiced salt, if for anybody who wanted to put it on their food. And it could be used as a sauce, or you could use the fermented paste without extracting a liquid from the sauce. By the way, in China, the fermented soybeans were used as a paste for a very long time, and they didn't. It was only in the last 400 or 500 years that they started extracting a liquid from it. But the Middle East, they were always extracting a liquid sauce, at least in the period of the cookbooks.
That's truly fascinating. And then also, like, back to the question about like disappearing flavors, disappearing techniques. Can you highlight some of those flavors that you notice are distinctly missing from the cuisine today relative to the medieval period?
Well, one of the most popular herbs was rue, sadab. I think it's fallen out of use because it's so bitter. but it does have a very charming aroma, kind of like plums. And it was very commonly added to a dish right at the end, the way we might add cilantro today. Another was caraway. Caraway is still used in some places, but it was a very frequent ingredient. And I happen to be very fond of it. I think of it as a polished gentleman, which is at home at any company. And I think also the flavor combination of roast meat and a sweet kind of pastry is particularly medieval. There was a dish called judab or judaba. You would roast meat in a tandoor. And then when the meat was nearly done and the juices and the fat were dripping from it, you would insert a tray of something underneath to catch the juices. And it might be a tray of crepes wrapped around a nut filling. It might be rice pudding. It might be bread pudding. It could be a kind of an apricot pudding. And then you would serve a piece of this with the shredded meat on top. People did this at home, but it was also one of the favorite foods in the marketplace. In the 1001 Nights, there are references to people eating it. I mean, they could smell it being cooked all the time, so it was on people's minds.
So in like street foods? Street
foods, yes. There are lots of street foods.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a very important point here. Like today there's a dominant sort of structure to a meal as sort of like appetizers, which will include small dishes, the entree, and like we usually think of the dessert as the end of the meal. But it does seem that in the medieval period, all this was sort of, the lines were blurrier.
Well, it depends on where you were in the Maghreb. They did serve meat at a banquet. They did have a rigid order of courses, and they were very proud of it. They thought this was much more sophisticated than putting everything on the table at once. In the Meshrik, everything did tend to be served at once, but things could be removed and new things added. But the idea of having a sweet as the final course is derived from late medieval European practice, because they believed that you should, before you had the meal, you had to have an appetizer, an aperitif, to open the stomach so it could receive the food. And then when you finished the meal, you had to have something to close the stomach, and they thought a sweet food would do that. I don't think that's a very good medical idea, but I'm glad they came up with it.
And actually, this notion of the medicinal properties of food is very salient in these medieval cookbooks. Can you talk a little bit more about that? It seems not only the medicinal part, but even the whole first chapter of the book is dedicated to incense and aromatics and perfumes.
Well, the idea that food is medicinal is practically universal. I mean, it's you're taking something into your body, and so you assume it will have some kind of effect on you. And there's always something to it, and that's also, and then there's also a certain amount of guesswork. Some people cared intensely about that. Some people only cared when they got sick, and then they started trying to do what their doctor told them to do. And some recipes do spell out medical values for the food. Often, a lot of cookbooks plagiarized recipes from medical encyclopedias, because the doctors often had included recipes as something as a treat to a patient, because it went along with their medical ideas. And since these recipes were in effect prescriptions, they were much more carefully written than the usual medieval recipe. And so cookbook writers eagerly and gladly copied them into their own books, with or without the medical information, sometimes with, sometimes without. Now, what was the second part of your question again? It was,
well, I was curious if you could, it was a big loaded question about not just the medicine, but the perfumes and the aromas.
The perfumes, yes. Well, the banquet was the banquet was the supreme social occasion where it was everything. You would have food, and you would have sparkling conversation. People would be telling their best anecdotes. You might have a singer, you have somebody reciting poetry. And the food, of course, was very fragrant, and the guests were supposed to perfume themselves. There were specific perfumes for the hands, for the beard, for the hair, and you could also perfume your clothes. And this is, before coming to the meal, you would have gone to the hammam, and there you would have had a rub down with some sort of aromatics. So it was sensory overload. And so in the Middle Ages, people who read cookbooks were not surprised to find recipes for perfumes or even for breath fresheners or antiperspirants.
Can you give us some, what were some of the ingredients that went into this so that we could sort of imagine or transport us to what these scents and flavors were like?
Well, a lot of them were in the book I just recently translated. They concentrated on expensive aromatic ingredients like agar wood. It's, I think, just called oud in Arabic usually, and it's like sandalwood, but better and more expensive. And the very expensive perfume ingredients, musk and ambergris. They used these with a free hand. As a matter of fact, they would figure out ways to put these perfume ingredients into dishes. You might aromatize a bowl that you were going to serve some food in. And I understand that still sometimes done in the Middle East. I've come across a dish called neshawiya, where the bowl was aromatized with sandalwood, and then the pudding was put in it. And so you could use it as a perfume. It just, it would smell good as it is, or you could burn it as an incense. There's also one recipe for a floating aromatic thing, and it was all a way of adding to the rich aroma of the meal, because they would have been using these incense at the meal just as they might in everyday use around the house.
You touched on something very interesting here, and something that I've come across also when I read cookbooks. There's this modern phenomena that people talk about, like molecular gastronomy, and it's sort of what it does implicitly is it makes that the cuisine of the day seem advanced relative to the past. But what struck me in these cookbooks is that they're loaded with a lot of culinary techniques to enhance the flavor of foods. Can you walk us through some of these techniques, a technique that you sort of adapted from the medieval period in your contemporary kitchen?
Oh, I know I've done that. Something is on the tip of my tongue that I could mention. But I've cooked a number of these dishes, and so something must have rubbed off. I just can't think of the one particular one that I would like to mention. It'll come back to me later, and I'll interrupt you.
Sure, that's fine. That's fine. And actually, I because I know your secret ingredient or your single ingredient, I want to touch back on the question of fermentation. And one thing that stood out to me about in the chapter on the fermented foods is that I always think of preserved lemons as a North African dish, and I was quite surprised to find that preserved lemons or hamod mraqqad were prepared in Bilad al-Sham, in the Levant. And I'm also recently I read a piece by Annie Gall who talked about how couscous was prevalent across even through the Levant, where we might not necessarily consider couscous today, as since it's become nationalized in North African cuisine. So I was wondering if there are other dishes today that maybe were more prevalent throughout the region, but that today we only think of in very specific parts of the Arab world? Like, again, dishes that have receded.
Well, I'm thinking about that just Judab. It was known in North Africa. The thing is, it requires you to use a tandoor, and they didn't have the tandoor in North Africa. They had the European brick oven. So it reads like a very bad version of Judab if you're used to the Syrian and Iraqi versions. I'm trying to think. We'll circle back to this.
We'll circle back to that. And I mean, I guess the reason I'm asking these questions, because it's also very interesting to think about how technologies, you mentioned the tandoor and the brick oven, that also external factors, not just ingredients, shape the flavors of the foods that we eat, which I find very, a very useful lens for reading these books. And then let's jump in.
I just could point out here, in the case of couscous, the couscous we think of is steamed. That's the North African couscous. It's made by just stirring your hand through a bowl of flour that you sprinkle with water and little granules form. Yeah. And because this wheat has not been kneaded, there's no, the gluten has not been awakened. And so when you steam it, the granules can absorb a large amount of water from the steam. But originally, apparently, couscous referred to a kind of soup noodle, because there are all the recipes from North Africa. As a matter of fact, all the recipes for couscous in the East as well give two kinds of couscous: North African couscous, which is the steam thing, and then a tiny soup noodle. You knead a hard dough, and then you twist it in a little tiny thing. And there are still traces of this in North Africa as well. But the couscous is an example rather of a technology really taking over. I mean, the steaming of couscous created a magnificent dish, and already in, I think, the 14th century, there's a tale about someone who was visiting, I think, Mecca, and he started to die away until they fed him couscous, and that brought him back to life.
That's fascinating. I'm sure you have like these, actually those stories are really funny. I think, and I was watching one of your presentations and you talked about the notion of elevated cuisine, how people described food as being elevated, which is, a phenomenon that we continue to see today. How did people, you described like a linear scale of a hierarchy or of excellence. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, of how people conceptualize food as being better, or what dishes being better than others?
I think they valued delicacy, although it's a highly favored cuisine, but they valued delicate textures. For instance, I mentioned there were three different kinds of pudding. There was a seed, which was just a sort of a porridge. And then there was khabisa. That's a word that comes from Aramaic, and obviously represented the cuisine of the Aramaic-speaking people of the Fertile Crescent. And that was thickened with flour. And then there was, I'm getting old. I'm forgetting the fanciest version. Was faludaj. Was all as a Persian dish. Faludaj is just a Persian word meaning refined, and it was always thickened with cornstarch, so it had a more delicate texture. That is one thing that is clearly the case. Now, if you go back to older cookbooks, the 10th century cookbook, Kitab al-Tabikh by Ibn Sayyar, that represents the cuisine of the court of Baghdad. And court cuisine is always full of extravagant marvels, stuffing one animal with another, and then stuffing that with another animal, and so forth. There's one recipe in that book where you take a calf and you have 5 different kinds of stuffings, one for each leg. You take the leg bones out, one for the body cavity. Or there's a recipe for fish, where you soak the fish, you put the fish in a tank of wine for a while, and the idea that this is going to give the fish flesh flavor, if it doesn't kill it, I suppose. But there would all the emphasis on rare ingredients, and that went back to the Persians, who's they were the cuisine of the Persian court was the inspiration for the cuisine of Baghdad, and they're doing extraordinary things. They like to they like to cook foods in the fat of wild animals. Wild animals don't have much fat. They like to cook things in gazelle fat, a pastry cooked in gazelle fat. I mean, you'd have to go down to the gazelle store and buy 2 or 3 gazelles to have enough.
Wow.
So there's always a spectrum. People, and of course it has to do with fashion. Things like that were fashionable in the Persian court, but in Baghdad, people were not putting so much emphasis on gazelle fat, or frying hemp seeds in the fat of the mountain goat. It's another insane thing that they were doing in medieval Persia.
And in medieval Syria and Bilad al-Sham, where they use, because I see references to the tail fat, I'm assuming that's the similar variety of sheep that we see today, the Awasi, or was that something different?
No, it was the same. It was the same. Actually, the sheep with the fat tail were developed later than the original domestication of sheep, and they became most widespread. Sheep with fat tails only survive out at the margins in Europe and in remote parts of Morocco, and then out in Indonesia, places like that. Everywhere else, people have fat-tailed sheep because of the fat is so easy to harvest the fat from the sheep that way, and also it tastes better. It has a lower melting point, and so of European sheep, the fat, it sticks to the roof of your mouth. It's very unpleasant.
Yeah,
the fat-tailed sheep, the fat is delicious. People eat it on purpose.
Yeah, and it gets folded into the kebab. And I remember when I was in Aleppo, I had a kibbeh, that was stuffed with the tail fat of the Awasi sheep, and that was a surprise because I was expecting meat, and then it just dripped all over me.
That was wonderful.
And I think it's also famous in Zaatar. Zaatar is famous for their kibbeh. Well, I do want to make sure to leave plenty of time for questions, but I do want to get to your single ingredient. So these are the books. If you do not have these books, I highly recommend them. They're fascinating resources to read through. And it really gives an idea of how cuisine changes. And you could, as Charlie mentioned, there are skeletons of dishes, like the backbones, the essence of dishes, but you could really see a transformation and a sheer variety that's, I found very remarkable. And these are some select recipes, which I did want to highlight this, which we didn't get a chance to talk about textures, but textures, is also something that's very, it changes over time, what people like to feel on their tongue. I saw this and I saw that they liked the sliminess or the slipperiness of the seeds of cucumber. And I recently did a project about mlokhiyeh, and I was trying to think about how people thought about the sliminess of mlokhiyeh today versus what people may have thought about it, because there are in Scents and Flavors 4 recipes for mlokhiyeh that are fantastic. But let's jump to your single ingredient. And these talks.
Thank you.
Oh. Aha.
There we are.
Kamakh Abyad. And it's single process, right? Because this is not, this is includes a few ingredients. So can you walk us through these photos, please?
Yes, today Kamakh just seems to be a fancy word for pickles. It's used in restaurant menus and cookbooks. In the Middle Ages, it tended to be condiments that were based on milk. This one is Kamakh Abyad, and it's very simple to make. In essence, it's a cheese that does not need any special equipment. All you need is a bowl and a stirring spoon, and you have to have a fine wire mesh to put over it, because once this thing starts becoming a cheese, little tiny insects you never knew were in the air will fall in. They'll be attracted to fall in, and they'll make for little spots of bitterness. But that's really amazing. And things I never guessed were in the air. You start out with a mixture of 1 part salt, 1 part yogurt, and 5 parts milk, and you stir it up. And then the recipe says to put it on your rooftop in the hottest part of summer. Well, I was making this in Los Angeles. My rooftop is not flat. And besides, there's a lot of cats in the neighborhood. So I put it on a hot pad at the very lowest setting. And since it was not going to be getting as hot as it would in summer on a rooftop, you have to top it up. You have to stir it twice a day. And then as the milk evaporates, you have to stir in more milk. I generally stirred in some evaporated milk, because I figured I was making up for the lack of the summer heat. But what happens is, after a couple of weeks, it starts to thicken, and you start to get a cheese flavor. And it ends up after, I think this is about 10 or 12 weeks, rather thick like this. The reason it develops the cheese flavor is that the bacteria that cause the cheese flavor are in milk when it comes directly from the animal. And you just have to make sure that the more aggressive and evil bacteria don't make it taste bad. And the lactic acid of the yogurt and the salt apparently do that, because it comes out, it tastes like a cheese, like a cheddar cheese, only a little sharper, a little more salty. And there you are. You have it. It was used as a spread on bread, just like a modern cheese spreads like boursin. And the thing is, since it's semi-liquid like this, you can mix in flavorings, and they did. They mixed in herbs, as in boursin, or garlic, or rose petals, or spices. I have made this by adding cinnamon to this, and a cinnamon flavored cheese, I have to say, is just delightful. I think it should make a comeback. I think some chef should make this his signature dish. Easy to make. It's basically a matter of waiting, stirring it up and topping it up from time to time for a couple of weeks, and that's all you have to do. And there it is. And,
I think that's brilliant, and I think your use of the heating pad is very is great. I did want to ask if anyone's gonna make this at home. When you keep adding milk, are you using raw milk? Are you boiling it again and then adding it? How did you make it? Did you put it directly into the mixture?
Yeah, I mean, you use pasteurized milk, or as they say, canned evaporated milk.
Evaporated, right?
Yeah. The evaporated milk just it makes it thicken up faster than it would otherwise if you're using a heating pad. And that's all that it is. It's just the slow action of the cheese bacteria on the milk, and it's just like magic. I put this in my breakfast nook, and let me tell you, it was quite the conversation piece. People would say, "What's that?" I'd say, "It's going to be cheese."
Did you leave it out for the full 40 days? Is that, or?
I've never left it out for the full 40 days. I've left it out for about 25 or so, and it's perfectly good by that point. People like to pick 40 days as the appropriate length of time for it to ferment something, because that's a period of time that's associated with ordeal and purification. And of course, you would want to think that you could see an ordeal's going on. You'd certainly hope that it was going to be purified.
Yeah. It's so interesting because, well, one, the whole setup reminds me when I first made Shanklish and I was in my home in Baltimore, I wanted to replicate sort of the environment of the region. Baltimore is a lot more humid. So I put a dehumidifier with a fan next to it to sort of reduce the likelihood of it molding too quickly.
Good thinking. Good thinking.
Yeah. Someone should like write down all these techniques. This is brilliant. I did want to ask you about another fermentation that I'm sort of, when I was living in Aleppo, there was different types of the Kamakh that you typically have with tea. And there was one bakery in particular that had Kamakh that tasted better than all the other bakeries. And it was, if anyone's from Aleppo on this call, it was in Bab al-Faraj. And it was, I believe, an Armenian bakery. And unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to see how they prepared it. It never worked out scheduling wise.
By the way, bakers are very secretive. They might not let you know at all. When I was traveling to Syria in 1980, we stopped off at every town. I would go into the bakery and I'd see something new is unique to that town. I asked how it was made. I got the most confusing answers. And finally, my driver said, "Not to their own sons. Not until they're on their deathbeds will they reveal their secrets."
That is absolutely true. There was a short anecdote. When I was in Aleppo, there was a really good bakery by my house, and I really wanted to see how they make the sweets. The first time I was there in 2007, he said, "Come back tomorrow, come back tomorrow." My 2 weeks were gone, and I went back to the States. I came back in 2009 for a wedding, "Come back tomorrow." Then it was Eid, and then he said, "We're busy." And I went back to the States. When I went in 2010 and I was going to be there for a year, he kept doing the same thing, "Come back tomorrow." And after 6 months, he goes, "Look, I don't know how to tell you this, but I don't feel comfortable sharing what they call sir al-mihne, the secrets of the trade." But luckily I had made a relationship with the workers, because everywhere I'd go, I'd take a tray of their sweets. And that I was very fortunate and lucky he said, "Come back tomorrow, bring all your photography gear." And that was one of the most memorable experiences that I had in Aleppo. But you're absolutely right. They were very persistent and hesitant to let me in. I'm
surprised the baker didn't say "Bukra fil mishmish."
Yeah, he tried to like evade the answer several times in many ways. There is a rapid Q&A, which, hopefully we can get some, let's see. So what are you reading / watching right now?
Right now, I'm working on another manuscript. I produced an edition of that Syrian cookbook. I based it on 8 manuscripts. There are about 15 of them in the world's libraries.
Wow.
And one manuscript is quite different from all the rest. And it's clearly a hasty, cheaply copied, sloppy edition, but it's differently organized and the recipes are somewhat different. And so I'm preparing an edition of that. I don't know that anybody's going to want to translate it. It's strictly for people who really, really care about this kind of stuff. But it's answering some questions for me, and that's why I'm devoting all my effort to it.
Wow, and you said it's a Syrian manuscript, or it's from Bilad al-Sham?
Yeah, obviously it's the earliest one. It dates from about I think the year 1303 in the Christian calendar. I forget what the other date is.
Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
I think perhaps Ziryab, the guy who was kicked out of Baghdad by Ibrahim ibn al-Mawsili. I think he was the arbiter of elegance who went to North Africa, and he introduced a number of things, including the idea of serving food in different courses. He strikes me as a very interesting guy.
Yeah, I have he's like a fashionista and Renaissance man. What is your guilty pleasure midnight food choice?
Well, I always have some Lebanese around, and so it's whatever I want to throw into it. I have minced up apricots, dried apricots, and mix them with Lebanese and let them sit around for a little while to soften. And that's pretty good.
That sounds, I do love dried fruits, and apricots are one of my favorites. The fourth question, and then we're going to get to, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Can you link the books mentioned? Yes, I'm sure there will be links for the books, but what dish reminds you most of home?
Well, home for me is Los Angeles. So I don't know. I think it's probably enchiladas.
Yeah.
Eating a lot of Mexican food. My father had a theory that Mexican food recharged his battery.
I'd go with that. I love Mexican food, and enchiladas are delicious. That was actually an interesting point, where you consider home, and Los Angeles. So let's see. Someone asked, and I know there's some people raising their hands. I'm gonna offer to unmute you, Rima Rifai. Do you wanna?
Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
Do you know how old is the traditional Zaatar mixes in the Levant?
No, I don't. That's a very interesting thing. Many of the popular things of today are not necessarily very old, but there's no way to find out. The ingredients have always been around, where they combined in a casual way without any idea that it was a specific flavor combination. It's not in the medieval books. It's a total mystery to me.
Huh.
And one note that I'll add about Zaatar is when I was living in Aleppo, I was surprised that the Zaatar there is very, it has a whole bunch of other ingredients that are not the Zaatar leaves and the simsom. It has adame, which are the dried chickpeas. It has cumin. I have a photo of it, but I don't remember the long list of ingredients that are in the Aleppan, which is more brown Zaatar.
Sounds like it's a whole dish.
Yeah, it's very flavorful, and it actually rounds out the sourness of the more like pure Zaatar, which I don't like to use that word, but yeah. There's another question from Hala.
Yes,
Hala.
thank you so much. Thank you very much. It was a very, very interesting talk and conversation. And I had a couple of questions. I put them in the chat, but I'm going to read them out. So the original title of the book, Sense and Flavor, in Arabic is Al-Wasla ila al-Habib. Perhaps gives us a hint about the purpose of, or the reason why the book was written. I mean, of course, I read the book. I have the book. I read the book, and I see that you refer to it as a link to a friend, but actually, I mean, in Arabic, Habib is really more like the lover. So, I mean, if we look at it this way, how would we understand the context of this book? I have another question. Shall I give the two questions and then we listen to the answers? So the other question is, when we compare Al-Wasla al-Habib with two other cookbooks that I know well, the one from Baghdad, Kitab al-Tabikh, and the one from Cairo, Kanz al-Fawaid, do you see a lot of overlap?
Oh, certainly, absolutely. There's a great deal of overlap. These countries were adjacent to each other, and they were the fashionable dishes. And one of the things I've always loved about the Middle East is people have no hesitation at all about taking dishes from someplace else if they like them. As for Habib, of course, you know, it doesn't have to be a lover. You know, you address anybody you like as yeah, Habibi. And the introduction to the book explains that he's justifying, in the introduction, he's justifying the study of food. He's already quoted the Quran to explain that there's no sin to it, but he also says that if good food is a positive moral plus, because it brings people together and puts them in a good mood and encourages sociability. And that's why it's the link to the friend.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting. Actually, the overlap between the books is not only about that people were eating the same. I mean, my question is perhaps, do you think that they actually copied from each other?
Oh,
recipes?
yes, absolutely. Sometimes you can tell you can recognize the exact same text. In other cases, well, you remember that a dish is something that is current at a particular time, and their various versions are always floating around, and individual cooks are making their own variations. And one of the things I noticed was that Baghdadi cookbook that you've seen the cover of that. Later in that century, someone added a bunch of recipes and named the new book Kitab Wasf al-At'ima al-Mu'tada.
Yes.
And most of the recipes that he copied from Baghdadi's book are slightly changed. The ingredients are a little bit different. The cooking techniques are a little bit different. And then in the 15th century, the original Baghdadi book was translated into Turkish. And in the Turkish translation, nearly all the original recipes are slightly changed to go along with the taste of the translator's time, or perhaps the translator's own taste. So there are always variations going on. Food is a continual movement.
I agree, fully agree. Yeah, thank you. Very nice, very interesting.
Thank you. And there was a comment about that's not Zaatar, that's yes. The naming names are very elusive and they change a lot. In Egypt, I know they use from the Arabic word for duck, but absolutely. I just wanted to agree with that.
Of course.
Mikey said the next question is Jeremy. If you want to unmute.
Yes, I am. Sorry, I'm on my phone over here. Good evening from Abu Dhabi, and thank you, Charles, for such a lovely talk. I was honored one time to go to a soiree that you held in Los Angeles of medieval Arabic cooking, hosted by Michael Cooperson. So it's nice to see you in this venue. I had a question about whether there were any sort of celebrity chefs in this time period, or people just, they held a banquet and this chef showed up and wowed everybody, something like that. Or if really the only people who were, headliners at a banquet or something like this were singers and other front of house people. Thank you.
Oh, there certainly were celebrity chefs. The 10th century book mentions various celebrity chefs of the court of Baghdad, and this Syrian cookbook also. Well, the writer of the book, or one of the contributors to the book, was a member of the Ayyubid clan, and he does not hesitate to brag about how many wealthy and important Ayyubids he knew, and how many he clearly was going around to the households of his rich relatives and crashing there for a while and eating pretty well. And he will name the chef he learns a particular dish from.
And I also wanted to add to that on page 215 of there's several references, but I was struck by a recipe from the daughter of the governor of Mardin, in terms of like both celebrity chefs and like people of high status, and also how food travels. There's a recipe for a bottled gourd pickle, which is just very neat. Like so many nuggets of stories in these books. So there are a couple more questions. I know we're technically over time. I just wanted to get, Mikey, is there any?
I think maybe let's do one last question and then wrap it up.
All right. Okay, Tim, go ahead. Tim,
yeah, I just mentioned this question is, were there any kind of differences for the different religious groups that were there in cooking? I assume not, because they're just one people and one culture, but I would love to hear your take on this.
Oh, it's hard to say. The books sometimes mention particular groups. If they like the dish, they'll adopt it and start cooking it on their own. But there seems to have been a great amount of there seems to have been a general sort of culinary culture that included, for instance, Egypt and Iraq, as well as Syria, and at the time of the Syrian book that I translated. And it's because, you know, the well-to-do knew each other, and if they visited each other, they would like to have dishes they were familiar with, or they might bring along their own chef in order to impress their hosts.
Okay, thank you so much. My assumption is just food unites us, so wanted to hear your take on this. Yeah, thank you so much for everything.
Of course, that's a whole, that we can have a conversation just about that. But thank you so much, Charles Perry, for this wonderful conversation. The talk will be available online for anyone who isn't able to make it or had to run out. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the day, wherever they are. And thanks again, Charles, for your time and your knowledge.
My pleasure.
Have a good one, everyone.